which talks about the 400-year period of something or other, and I pointed out to you that that verse is three ways ambiguous, because it says three things will happen. You'll be strangers, your descendants will be strangers in the land that's not theirs, is one thing. And they will serve them, meaning your descendants will serve the inhabitants of the land. That's two. And they will cause them deprivation. That is to say, the inhabitants of the land will cause your descendants deprivation. That's three. And then it says 400 years. So you have A, B, C, 400 years. And there are three ways to read that. You could read it A plus B plus C all together will take 400 years. That would be the minimum time period that the verse is indicating. Or you could read it A and B will take, A will happen, and then B and C will take 400 years, which would indicate more time. Or you can read it, A will happen, comma, and B will happen, comma, and C will be 400 years. And that would be the maximum amount of time. So the verse could come true in a variety of different ways. And we will see that that's going to be very important. Now, let's see. In the preceding, the beginning of the paragraph, it says that God calculated the end in order to do what he had stated to Avram Avinu. So the question is, what did he calculate? What kind of calculation is necessary? Well, since I've just told you that the verse is three ways ambiguous, and it could come true in a variety of ways, so then the decision had to be made on high which way it should come out true. Now, there's a hint here. When it says he calculated the end, the word for end, this word for end in this passage is kates, kuf tzadi. The numerical value of kuf tzadi is 190. How many years did the Jews actually spend in Egypt? The answer is 210. The last time I checked, 400 minus 210 is 190. So, you have that period of 190, 400. Because Baruch Hu calculated that it should be for all three of those calculations, all three of those things. The time that their descendants will spend in a land that's not their own, and the time that they will serve the inhabitants of the land, and the time that they will deprive them, all of it together is 400. That's why they could end up only in the land of Egypt for 210 years, because the 400 starts with the birth of Isaac. Birth of Isaac is Abraham's descendant, and Abraham did not have possession of the land of Israel. So when it says that your descendants will spend time in a land that's not their own, that starts with the birth of Isaac. That's the way that he calculated the end. Now, the reason he calculated the end that way is because, as the oral tradition tells us, had he not taken the 400 years in the shortest possible time, the ABC in the shortest possible time, the whole thing 400 years, there wouldn't have been anybody left to save. We were disintegrating spiritually, culturally. Our identity was disintegrating. And therefore he chose the shortest period of time to make it happen. And that raises a question in the commentators, maybe there's some leftover business. He saved us, but didn't spend 400 years in Egypt, which could have been. So maybe in later generations we have to pay up some of what wasn't taken care of in Egypt. That's a whole long subject. It's all based on this three-way ambiguity in the verse, plus the idea of calculating the end. Okay, now the next paragraph, short, sweet, and ambiguous. Just 4 lines. And it is this that has stood by our fathers, not bad because it says Amda in Hebrew. Amda can mean just remaining static. It is this that has stood by our ancestors and for us, that not one alone stood up against us to destroy us. It wasn't only one time in history when we were in danger of being destroyed. Rather, in every generation, there are those who stand up against us to destroy us. And the Kodesh Baruch Hu saves us from their hand. Now, it's very short, really one sentence, is again ambiguous. It starts with, and this, vihi, singular, this thing is what stood for us throughout all the generations. Then it says, not only one oppressor stood opposed to us, threatening us throughout the generations. In every generation, there were those who wanted to destroy us, and Hashem saved us from their hand. So, you have the pronoun this, and then you have 3 things. So you have to ask, what's the this that's being referred to at the beginning of the sentence? This is what has stood for us. And here's what comes after that. Not only once did oppressors stand against us, rather oppressors stood against us in all generations, and Hashem saves us from their hand. So the natural reading is to think that the this goes only on the end. The background is we're under pressure, and there are those who want to destroy us, and what has stood for us in every generation is that God saves us in every generation from their hand and enables us to survive. That is a natural way to read it, not a wrong way to read it. It's not wrong. It's another way to read it, a bit more subtle, and that is, what has stood for us in every generation is that there are oppressors who are trying to kill us. That's what stood for us. That's what preserved us, that there are oppressors trying to kill us. And they don't succeed. Hashem saves us from their hand. This is, in fact, the way the Netziv takes it. The Netziv has a famous essay on anti-Semitism in general, and particular anti-Semitism in Golos, in exile. It's printed at the end of his commentary on the Song of Songs. And he recommends reading it that way for the following reason. Now, I hardly recommend reading the whole essay. It's one of the great, from a 20th century Rav. There's endless literature on anti-Semitism. It's just that all that endless academic literature has never heard of the Netziv. And they wouldn't take him seriously if they learned it because they're out of touch with reality. He says the following. The secret to success in exile, and by success I mean peace, appreciation, respect, cooperation, and even love on the part of the non-Jewish population, love in a certain sense, is to dwell isolated, separated, distinguished, with your own culture, antithetical to that of the people you live among, zero assimilation. That's the key to living peacefully and successfully. Yes, the secular psychologists and sociologists and anthropologists and economists, everything won't tell you that. Too bad. Bodad Yeshev, he should dwell alone, in isolation. Who made the first ghetto? History lesson. You want to get an academical, get it right? Joseph made the first ghetto. Joseph arranged that when his family came down to Egypt, they should live in Goshen. He told them to bring down their animals so that the Egyptians will despise them or separate from them because they eat the foods we kill and eat the animals that they hold as sacred animals. They should be distinguished and set aside from them. They practiced circumcision, which physically distinguished them from the Egyptians. They lived up to the traditions of the patriarchs, which distinguished them spiritually and culturally from the Egyptians. What was the result of that? What was the relationship between the Egyptians and the Jews in Egypt?
Eventually they got mad at the Jews.
Yeah, eventually. They said the key word, eventually they got mad at the Jews. But what happened between the condition that Joseph set up, on the one hand, and they're getting mad? I'll tell you what happened. What happened was that when the original sons of Jacob died, number one, they stopped performing circumcision. And number two, they did that, says the Netziv, because they wanted to live among the Egyptians. They wanted to be part of Egyptian culture. And we know that's true because when they left, God says to them, every woman should take from her Egyptian neighbor her possessions. So it's clear that they lived hand in glove with the Egyptians. And then when they ceased their physical isolation and their cultural distinction, that's when the Egyptians came to hate them. Now the Netziv quotes a very telling verse. Vayahafoch libam l'sno asamo. God overturned their hearts to hate his people. Which means that anti-Semitism isn't natural. So if you're looking into group psychology and anthropology and religious beliefs and so on and so on, you haven't got it. That's not where it's coming from. It's coming from the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu turned over their hearts to hate his people. Now the Netziv goes a step further, and he says, really, there's an animus of the non-Jewish world against Jewish belief, the Jewish belief system, the Jewish value system. But it can pay them not to act on it. It can pay them to be friendly, and another part of the psychology could be generally friendly. They definitely don't like our religious system. But that doesn't mean they have to oppress us. We spoke when we learned the Megillah Esther. At the end of the Megillah, when the Jews took action against those who they needed to weaken, it distinguished between oyev and soneh. Oyev is an enemy. That means someone who actively tries to disadvantage you. And a soneh is someone who hates you in his heart. He may not do anything. And he may not do anything because it doesn't pay, or he may not do anything because, although he does hate you, psychologists talk about a love-hate relationship. Not that when I quote them, it means to say that they say it's right, but in this case, I think they happen to be right. That you can have conflicting emotions. Says the Netziv that although there is a hatred for the Jewish religion, there can also be times in which that hatred doesn't show, because they have reasons not to show it. And they could be selfish reasons or cultural reasons or whatever you like. That's protected by our being isolated, different, distinguished, different in contrast to. Because Baruch Hu protects that. But if we lose that distinction, then Kodesh Baruch Hu overcomes their motivation to hide their hatred against our religion, and then they come out as full force. So we live, as the Netziv says, under the control of divine providence. We don't live under the aegis of nature at all, and therefore anti-Semitism itself is an expression of divine providence, and its trigger is our relationship to God and how we live up to the responsibilities that He gives us. And in particular, it's triggered by our failure to live up to this particular responsibility. And in the next paragraph, we will see the source of it according to the Netziv. But I'm just pointing out then that this little paragraph we're talking about is, again, syntactically ambiguous, courtesy of Noam Chomsky. The he is ambiguous. What does the this refer to? And it at least includes the fact that when there were that people stood up against us to destroy us, that was a means by which to bring the Jewish people back to its senses, to pay attention to what's going on around it, to remind it that it has abandoned the things that the only things that can guarantee that it will survive. And he does say that when you hear my explanation, you may object that there are periods of time when Jews don't live up to this survival strategy that I'm telling you, and yet their relationships with the non-Jewish population around them is a friendly one, and the hatred that's underneath it all for the Jewish religion doesn't show itself. He says that's true because there are verses that indicate that this feature of isolation is only one feature of the divine providence which determines how we shall be treated. There are other features as well. So that when there's isolation, you're doing what is most important to be worthy of divine protection. And when you abandon isolation, you're doing what is most dangerous to trigger divine punishment, but it's not automatic. Because God has more purposes in running the world than just this particular feature. And if that makes you feel then that since there's no guarantee that it'll work and no guarantee that failing it won't work, therefore it's not worth it or it's somehow futile, I'll remind you that almost all medicine is like that. Thank you. Almost all medicine does not give you guarantees that if you take the cure you'll be saved, or if you don't take the cure you won't be saved. They can't guarantee something like that. They talk probabilities. Because they know there are other factors that are involved which they're not aware of, and therefore they can't make guarantees like that. So if you believe in taking medical measures to help improve your health, then this should be very important to you. Yeah.
I have two questions. The first is that and then imply that arguments and claims that say, people are jealous of Jews and that's why they hate them. That's the cause of their hatred. There's some type of aspect of something related to Jews and Goy, and that's the cause of their hatred. Would that be then, those statements would they be incorrect?
Yes, that would be incorrect to say that that's so. And I think it goes the other way around. It's because they hate them that they're jealous of their wealth. Not all wealthy people in a society excite the jealousy of everybody else in the society. Of course, if you're the progressive left in America today, that's not true, but that's because they have a problem. But on the right, people aren't jealous and angry at wealthy people. Not at all.
So it's like almost like a post hoc justification. It's irrational.
Exactly. It's exactly. There are those people who say that the religious people in this country are hated because of not going to the army, let's say. Well, 120 years ago, 140 years ago, when Haskalah was rampant in Europe, and there were those who pretended to be religious to get into yeshivas, to sneak Tolstoy and Dostoevsky into the yeshivas, to seduce the yeshiva students away from Judaism. There was no complaint about the army then. And somehow they were against the religion and against us and against people and everything else. So it's very largely an excuse, not the real cause.
The other question too was the actual text itself. When they're talking about how people have risen up to destroy us in every generation, and then God has saved us, is it talking about just past events, or it's also making almost a predictive note, trying to say that this also in the future, this will happen, and God will also save us?
Well, it implies the future because it says for our ancestors and for us. That's for the reader. The us is the one who's reading the Hagaddah. So whenever he's reading it, it applies to him.
Also within our current generation, God will also save us, and also the future generation.
Well, yes, there is a guarantee that the Jewish people will not pass away. But that's not a guarantee for any particular individual or group. Let's remember that when they left Egypt, in the ninth plague, 80% of the population died. Not only that, but God said to Moses twice, because of their two transgressions, the golden calf and the spies, I'll wipe them all out, and I'll make a nation out of you. I promise there'll be a Jewish nation. You could be it. It'll go through a bottleneck, and then the population will expand out of you. So we can't look at that and say, okay, but everything will be all right anyway because Baruch is running the world and he promised us. So that's so simple. Yeah.
We assume assume it's the reader itself who's reading it as well. It's not. It's
Not as well. This is the only one that's. This is a text, right? Who else it could it be referring to?
When they wrote the text, were they referring to themselves, or they referring to?
No, I said for our ancestors and for us. Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you had a question. Okay, now you'll see the beginning of this story in the next words. But here's a little secret. The next thing is go and learn. Actually, say means to go out, to exit and learn. Go and learn. Now, in our literature, there are two phrases which are very widely used hundreds of times in our literature for an invitation to learn. In the Gemara, for the aficionados, what is it? Nobody knows. Ta shma, come and hear. That's a full contrast. The verb here is go out, and in the Talmud it's come. The verb here is learn, and there it's hear. And in Yerushalmi, and in the Zohar, it's toach chami or toach chazi, which means come and see. So now you have three different ways to invite learning. Come and hear, come and see, and go out and learn. That requires some investigation. In particular sense, go out and learn appears only once, whereas the others appear hundreds of times. So it means that come and hear and come and see are normal, everyday, ubiquitous invitations, and go out and learn is special. It's unique. Roughly, I'm just skimming the surface now, especially when you're talking about something that's in the Zohar. Come means we're going to have a discussion roughly on a par. I'm going to talk to you, and you'll talk to me, and we'll have a discussion together. Now, there's a difference between hearing and seeing. In particular, you can't communicate visually if it's dark. When it's dark, you can only communicate by voice, through hearing. When it's light, you can do either one. There's a big difference between seeing and hearing. Hearing is sequential. You can't hear the whole thing at one time. Therefore, hearing requires memory, which seeing doesn't. Because you look even at a complex picture, you can go back and forth, and if you want to compare things, you can take a look at it again. Whereas in hearing, that word's not coming back. In aesthetics, this is very important. There's between visual art and music, let's say. Therefore, in hearing, there has to be patterns. Can't be brand new information every step, because there's nothing for the mind to grasp onto and to structure it into to be able to remember it. So, in Babylonia, which is where the Talmud was written, the verse describes it as "B'mach hakim hoshivani Hashem." God caused me to dwell in darkness. That's where it says Toshma, come and hear. Now it's Israel, where the Zohar also was composed. There's not an explanation of darkness. Therefore, you could say, come and see. And then you think of what happened at Sinai. V'chol ha'am roi mesakolos, and Chazal push it. Roi mesanishma. They see that which is heard. You hear something very deep. Because we're talking about sounds which are heard and sequential, and here they were available to vision. That's a crossing of the wires. So it just gives you a hint that some very deep things are going on here. I want to now talk about what it says in the Hagaddah. This says exit. That means you're sitting in a wrong place. You're not where you belong. And in order to understand the message that we're going to give you, you have to get out of that wrong place and look at things with new eyes. According to the Netziv, and I think is more generally understood, the wrong position is to misunderstand the way the Jewish people relates to the non-Jewish world. In particular, to understand our status in exile, especially the periods where we seem to have relative peace and tranquility and acceptance. And that requires a special kind of learning in order to overcome that mistake. So, these two words are an introduction to the famous verse in the Torah. I'll just say one word about where this comes from. We're now going to read the official text which tells the story of the Exodus from Egypt. You would be forgiven if you would have anticipated that. If you are telling the story of the Exodus from Egypt, you should read from the book of Exodus. That would have been a natural assumption on your part. I think you would have been right. But that isn't what's going on. It's really a passage from the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 28. Why is that? Why would you do that? Now, it's a kind of compromise because you take the root text from Deuteronomy and then you take each phrase and you explain it by references to the book of Exodus and other places. So, you bring it in, sort of, but the text you're focusing on is a text from Deuteronomy. Why do that? And the answer is that the text of Deuteronomy describes what happens every year in Israel when the farmer has his first fruits and he brings them to the temple and he offers them, he gives them to a Kohen, and he says, these are the first fruits of my orchard, and I'm offering them in acknowledgement of the fact of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu did for us. And then he gives a synopsis of Jewish history. And it's those 4 verses which are the synopsis of Jewish history, which include our ancestors and our sojourn in Egypt and our exodus from Egypt. It's those 4 verses that we are going to explain in detail, phrase by phrase, here in the Hagaddah. Because the Hagaddah was written for people living in the land of Israel. It's written for people who were born in Israel and lived in Israel and had property in Israel and had a livelihood in Israel. So these verses express where they are. These verses are familiar to them. Many of them say them once a year, every year. So the idea is those verses are designed to take you from your present reality back into the history. As I told you several times already, the purpose of the whole exercise is to relive the Exodus, not just to read about it or talk about it, but to relive it. Here you have it built into the text. It's a present projecting into the past. That's what's going on. So now, this first verse, which is on this page, is, go and learn that the Aramean, that means a person from Aram is an area, planned to do with our father Egypt. Look what he did. For Pharaoh decreed only that the male children shall be put to death, but Lavan planned to uproot all. As it is said, the Aramean sought to destroy my father, and the latter went down to Egypt and sojourned there with a family, few in number, and he became there a nation great, mighty, and numerous. So, you read your helpful, friendly English translator's version, and you say, I don't see anything hidden here. I don't see anything mysterious here. Why do we mean that I'm sitting in the wrong place and I have wrong presuppositions and so forth and so on? Why would that be a problem? Because your English translator did all the work for you. In Hebrew, the first 3 words in Hebrew are Arami, Oved, Avi. Arami means an Aramean person. Oved can mean be lost, not finding your way, or it can mean to destroy. Either way, it's present tense and difficult. It's not normal grammar. And Avi is my father. So you could have read it, my father was a wandering Aramean. He did live in Aram for part of his time. He came to Israel. And went from Israel, he went down to Egypt. And he went back to Israel. He was moving around. Even in Israel, he moved from place to place. This could have been just a description of Abraham. Wouldn't have any connection with destroying the Jewish people at all. But that's not what it means. In particular, it's not what it means because of the continuation of the verse. And he went to Egypt. Now, as I have told you a number of times, in the Torah, when you say A happened and B happened, it's not just a list of events. Almost always, it means that A is part of the reason for B, the cause for B, the means to be. There's a connection between them. So I have to say, let's see, Arami Oved Avi, an Aramean wandered or tried to destroy or was destroying my father, and he went to Egypt. Which father went to Egypt? Which one of our fathers went to Egypt and had a relationship with an Aramean? What was the relationship? Well, it's Jacob. And as the verse says, that not only did he go there, but he became a nation there. So it's got to be Jacob. Okay, so which Aramean did Jacob have a relationship with? Lavan, his uncle, his father-in-law. What kind of relationship was that? Well, nobody was wandering there. He was with his uncle for 20 years. So, does his relationship with his uncle have anything to do with his going to Egypt? What's the connection? Says the Netziv, because survival in exile is only possible when you're isolated, when you're differentiated. And that is impossible in his experience with Lavan. And therefore he went down to Egypt, where he could be isolated in the way that Joseph set it up. Now, the Netziv doesn't explain why it would have been impossible in the context of Lavan, but I think he doesn't explain it because it's blaringly obvious. Lavan is his uncle. Lavan is the father of his wives. Lavan is the grandfather of his children. What are you going to do? Go off and live in a cave? Go live on a mountaintop? It's not going to work. So isolation is impossible under those conditions. And if isolation is the keystone of the divine guarantee for survival, then he's got to get out of there. He's got to get out of there. In Egypt, he could be isolated. This isn't obvious at all. The connection between what Lavan did and his going to Egypt isn't obvious at all. And it isn't even obvious that Lavan wanted to destroy everything. Yes, Lavan was a money-grubbing fellow. When Jacob came to him with nothing, he put him to work immediately, so that after 30 days, he's serving him and getting no wages. Lavan is dying of embarrassment. Even he could die of embarrassment. And says, what shall I pay you? You know, it's not fitting for you to serve me for nothing. So he wasn't a really generous fellow. But in the end, you don't see that he's trying to uproot everything, destroy everything. But if you read very carefully, you will. And we who are doing Chumash up until now, I pointed out then, because when Jacob flees, and Lavan comes chasing after him, Lavan says to him, among other things, you know, he came with his whole townspeople. He had force. He said, I have the power to do evil with you. And in Hebrew, the you is plural, not just singular, imachem. Now who's there? Jacob and Lavan's own daughters, and Lavan's daughter's children, who are his grandchildren, and some servants. So when Lavan says to Jacob, I had the power to do evil with you, plural, it's not just Jacob, then who else does he have in mind? And he says, but the God of your father came to me last night and told me not to do anything, not to talk about anything, so I'm stuck. I have the power, but I'm stuck. And later on in the conversation, Lavan says, everything you see in front of you is mine. The children are mine, and the flocks are mine. It's all mine. That gives you an idea of what his intentions were. Jacob, you have your own ideas. You're crazy. You're crazy. Your monotheism and your devotion to a power that has no form and no figure and no statue. I can't change you, but your children belong to me. Your culture is going to die when you die. Your children are my grandchildren, and you're living in my context. Everything belongs to me. That was where he wanted to uproot everything. He wanted to uproot everything, not necessarily by killing them all, though having run, he would have done that, but by claiming them culturally and spiritually to the point where there would be nothing left. So that's why, because this Aramean wanted to destroy my father, that's why Jacob went down to Egypt, to be there in isolation, says the Netziv, because isolation is the key for the divine assistance to be able to survive. There's a lot packed into this verse that you never would have guessed. This is part of Tseilmad, and the same thing applies in every generation. There are generations in which people feel safe in the non-Jewish world, outside the land of Israel, and they misinterpret what's going on. They misinterpret it as real friendship and real support and so forth and so on. I'm sure that if you would have interviewed a Jew in Germany in 1920 and asked him, how are things? He would have said, fine, spectacular. With my top hat and my curled mustache and my university degree and my factory with which I become one of the wealthy, and I have the respect of everyone around me, everything is fine. Wonderful. You guys still put on black boxes in the morning? You do? That's nice to hear. I don't need it, because everything's fine. Talked to a Jew in America 15 years ago. Today, many places Jews aren't safe walking in the street. You know that. So you have to have a much more skeptical attitude towards the. You should be grateful when the non-Jewish world does something for you, when it shows you some support. You should be grateful, but not overlook the inherent tension that exists in the relationships. That's something which is always constant, always there. Yeah. Always there. Okay. So no. So according to the Netziv, it's not because we're different. It's because we fail to be different. As long as we're different, they will not have this animosity to us. Or to put it more carefully, the deep underlying animosity to our religion won't come out because it doesn't pay. Number one, and number two, they may be experiencing conflicting emotions. Part of it is their animosity to the Jewish religion, and part of it is the fact that Jews are helpful and they bring benefits, and they often, Putin has over the years shown tremendous kindness to the Jewish population there, and also to Israel. Though now under the pressure of the Ukraine war, he's vacillating back and forth, because when he was a child and his family was starving, a Jewish family in the area gave him food, saved his life. Nobody else did that for them. No Christian did it. A Jew did it for him. So they see that, they experience that, and that leads them to have a genuinely good feeling about Jews. That doesn't mean they don't have a bad feeling about their religion. They have both. People are like that. But the good feeling leads them to not act on the animosity against the religion. This is what the Netziv says. When we are separate, then that's the way they present themselves. And when we don't separate ourselves, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu takes away that veneer of friendliness and so forth and so on, and then the inner animosity comes out. And again, it's not a rule that's going to be fulfilled every time, because as the Netziv says, there are other considerations that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has, when and where and how and exactly under what conditions. But that's the underlying dynamic. Yeah.
Would this also apply, and show, would there be an issue in almost having, let's say, Judaism as a whole be involved with or engaging with secular things, even in preserving itself in a certain way? Like, I'm thinking maybe, if I'm understanding,
No.
it's like why you?
Yeah, no, I would not say that, because, for example, Maimonides was a doctor. Many of the Amoraim were doctors, and the Rishonim were doctors. And I assume that they learned that at least from the non-Jewish sources. And he even quotes Galen, Rambam. So they learned these things, and they probably interacted with them. The Rambam was well, you could say he was honest, but he was the physician to the court of the caliph in Egypt. He was there all the time. So no, you don't have to you don't have to, shall I say, what Joseph set up was a separate residence. Don't see any reference to the idea that there was a fence around the residence and you couldn't go outside.
We don't have to segregate ourselves, you're saying.
Well, but segregate your residence, yes. I don't know, former President Jimmy Carter, in his campaign for the presidency, made a remark on the campaign trail. He said, it's well known that people like to live among their own. You know, Italians like to live with Italians, and Greeks like to live with Greeks, right? He was roasted for that. How could you say that? Today's progressives would applaud him. That's why at universities they segregate people. The blacks have their things, and the Asians have theirs, and the Spanish have theirs, and the whites have theirs, because they shouldn't transgress the other person's cultural territory. Idiocy, absolute idiocy. That's what they do. Separate graduation ceremonies. All black ceremonies. All this is inclusion and okay, don't get me started. So when you're distinguished in that way, that preserves their respect for you, and when you break those down and you look like them, that's when it goes to pieces. You say, but human psychology doesn't work that way. You're right, it doesn't work that way. This is special divine providence. It's exactly what the Netziv is saying, and that's the trap that the Hagaddah is trying to save you from. Because you look at it from what you know about human psychology, you say, bro, people don't act like that. That's the trap.
So as long as we're preserving our traditions and our religious practices, then it wouldn't be an issue of what we're doing.
I think that's right. That's certainly the way it's been done in America, particularly. The frum populations have really very largely separate places to live, but 6th Avenue is where the Diamond District is, and there are Jews there every day, from Flatbush and from Borough Park and other places. You know, they come in. There's the Muncie bus, the daily Muncie bus, where they drive to work, and they daven on the bus. And there's a Sefer Torah on the bus, and they have Kriyas Torah, and they stop the bus on the side for the Shemona Esrei, and they're there with talis and tefillin, and the hour-long bus ride is when they daven, right? And they go to work in Manhattan. You know, what my mechutin, my daughter is married to his son, works for Wells Fargo. He's one of the vice presidents of Wells Fargo. He goes to Wells Fargo every day. So then that's not regarded as a violation of this. But he lives in Muncie. Part of the idea is this: when you interact with people who aren't a part of your culture, you have to be careful not to give offense, not to do or say something which is going to be difficult for them to take, or not respectful. So you're on your guard, rightfully. That's where you should be. You're careful. If you're considerate of other people, you should be on your guard. But you shouldn't live your whole life on your guard. When you go home and you're surrounded by people with whom you share a culture, then you can relax and you can trust your habits to be faithful to generate the right interactions with people. It's a different experience.
So there's not an issue of surrounding yourself then, particularly with people of who aren't religious. Isn't there a concern that there could be influence on behalf of them on the environment that you're in?
You're talking again. In your residence, your domicile, you should be among your own, right? That means all the holidays and the daily davening and the Torah shirim are all going to be on your own. And some number of hours of the day, you'll be out doing something else. That's okay. Could it be better if you're working within the? Yeah, it could be better, but it's not going to violate what the Netziv is talking about, as far as I understand. Yeah.
One is, so this hate, this animosity towards religion, that's a God-given thing. It just.
I don't know. He hasn't. I'm in the middle of reviewing this with the Chavrusa now, and he has not yet explained where that comes from.
Okay.
So maybe by the end of the week, I'll be able to tell you.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
And also, doesn't it kind of make sense? I feel like in a way, where the closer we are, the more like them we are, the more animosity could be generated. Because if you have someone who's basically like trying to act like you, kind of, and they're like close to you, but then there's like you know that there's a real intrinsic difference, then that can create its own kind of resentment and animosity.
Well, first of all, the question would be how they know that there's a real intrinsic difference.
Okay.
But worse than that, I mean, what you're talking about is this lunacy of cultural appropriation. If I put on a sari, I'm insulting people from India because I'm appropriating their culture. Man, that's nuts. I'm showing an appreciation. If anything, I'm showing that I think that they have something that's nice, that's pleasant, that's. Now let's take it for example. Let's take meditation. When meditation was exported from the East to the West, were the people in the East angry that we were expropriating their culture? That's insane. That means in the West we're saying we're missing something, we're suffering something. You have the solution. We're going to borrow it from you to improve our lives. Was any American upset when people all over the world started wearing jeans and drinking Coke? So, sorry, that's American stuff. Don't take that stuff. That belongs to us. It's nuts. It's crazy. So I don't see why, especially if someone comes as an immigrant and he assimilates to the ways of the local population. Local populations to see that's normal. That's what usually happens historically. And if anything, it means come to appreciate that the way we do things is a good way to do things. Why should he be insulted by that? Okay, so that's the first verse. Then it says that when he went down to Egypt, it says specifically, he went down to Egypt and he sojourned there. Now, there are various verbs to take up residence in a place, and the main one is leshevis, which means to dwell in a place. Doesn't mean to sit, that's leshev. And it's not used here. Vayogar means to be there as a temporary resident, but always thinking of going back, not bonding to the place. Right? So then the question is, if you went down, and you went down only to be a sojourner there and not to really bond, you think of coming back, why did you go down in the first place? You were thinking it was better there, grass is greener there, so why did you go? The Hagaddah comments, compelled by the divine decree, because Joseph was in Egypt. Jacob mourned for Joseph for more than 20 years. When he found out that Joseph was alive, it was in the middle of a famine. Now, theoretically, he could have stayed in the land of Israel, and Joseph could have provided for him. He would have sent him food. He was second in command of Egypt. Joseph said, come down. Jacob wasn't sure. So he went down to Beersheba. In Beersheba, he offered sacrifices to the God of his father, Isaac, because Isaac also wanted to go to Egypt in a famine, and God told him, don't go to Egypt. So Jacob says, well, what shall I do? My grandfather, Abraham, went down to Egypt in a famine, and God was okay with that. My father wanted to go down in a famine, and God said not to do it. So, what about me? His son Joseph is in Egypt. He wants to go. But on the other hand, God told his father not to go, so he stops in Egypt, in Beersheba, offers sacrifices to the God of his father Isaac. Instruct me what I am to do. And God comes to him that night in a dream and says to him, go down to Egypt. So he's going down with divine authority behind it, and the fact that his son is in Egypt, viceroy in Egypt, that's not an accident. That's also divine providence. So he was clearly maneuvered into this position by divine providence, and that's why he went down, but he himself never thought of taking up residence there. Okay, we'll talk about this some more time.